Dr. DiClemente is Professor Emeritus, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He earned his PhD from the University of Rhode Island. He is an internationally renowned psychologist in addiction and health behavior change. And of particular importance to Smart Recovery, he is a co-developer of the Stages of Change model, which is widely used in Smart. He's garnered some major awards from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the American Psychological Association, and the American Society of Addiction Medicine. One of his numerous publications is Addiction and Change. There's only a few books in the last few decades that I have read word for word, and this is one of them. He starts by explaining how addictive problems develop, which then sets the stage for explaining how they can be resolved. Not everybody gets the whole picture. Over the years at conferences and conventions, I have attended poster sessions where I have bumped into Carlo. And a poster session is a row of freestanding large bulletin boards where typically young science investigators post a big poster with a summary of their recent work, often their graduate project of some type. I've watched Carlo working the room. He goes around and he gathers new scientific findings, and most importantly, he supports and mentors his younger colleagues. So Carlo is here today with Smart Recovery, supporting and mentoring us. We're going to get a preview of some of his forthcoming work. His topic is recycling and recovery. Dr. Carlo DiClemente.
Thank you, Tom. That was very gracious. So the subtitle of this is really finding value in unsuccessful attempts to change, and I think that'll become clear as we go along. I really have no conflicts of interest in what I'm presenting. I do want to acknowledge all the students and colleagues who have helped build all the work that we've done and our understanding of the model, as well as its application. And I want to take a moment to say I'm grateful for the many years of collaboration shared with Jim Prochaska, who passed away a year or two ago. And I'm also very pleased to remember and honor Richard Saitz. He's a colleague and a friend. Actually, we ran into each other and had a dinner together at the last conference that I was at and he was at. He was talking about stigma, and he really has made a wonderful contribution in both SBIRT and in stigma. So just wanted to kind of make sure we all get that. So if we think about SAMHSA's view of recovery, I mean, this was 2012, they came out with this. They call it a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live self-directed lives, and strive to reach their full potential. And I think it's forward-looking, and it's about health and wellness. And I think that's really important. Recovery is built on access to evidence-based clinical treatments, recovery support services for all populations. But as all of us know, recovery often requires repeated attempts. So it's not just putting a Band-Aid on a wound and waiting for the wound to heal. It's not just stopping using a substance. It's not just going to treatment. It's really a journey of change. And that's what hopefully we'll see and understand a little better. So I've been doing some work looking at failure, actually, and the role of failure in various areas of life. And I'm looking and thinking, well, what are we doing for our own self in terms of how do we kind of look at this? Tom, did you have a question? Okay.
No, sorry.
That's okay, no problem. So when I was thinking about blueprints, so blueprints for a building or a bridge show how to construct a structure, all the specifications, what you have to do to kind of get it going and build it. When something goes wrong with a building or a bridge or any kind of construction, you look at the problem in light of the specifications, you look at the blueprint to see what the cause was and whether it was due to the materials, the execution of the construction, vulnerability of the design, lack of upkeep, or some external causes. The transtheoretical model is not a theory, it's a model because it offers a blueprint for looking at the entire process of intentional behavior change. So this blueprint contains some structure and specifications for making a successful change and for understanding what may be going wrong in unsuccessful attempts. So that's where we're going to go, is kind of looking at the model. Now, the model has often been called the stages of change model, but it's really a lot more comprehensive than that, as we kind of started out with the first book in terms of the transtheoretical approach. So the stages are really kind of the temporal motivational dimension. The processes are really the engines, the things that you're trying to get clients to do so that they can complete the tasks. And these are not, processes are not esoteric processes, even though we have a lot of words and name them in psychological terms. If you turn on the TV and watch anything and watch any of the commercials, you will see the TV and the commercials trying to engage these processes to get you to buy whatever it is that they want you to buy. So the processes are important, but we're going to talk more about the tasks of the stages today. The other thing that we realized early on is when we're thinking about a behavior change, it's pretty specific, but that behavior change happens in the context of that person's life. So you've got all kinds of contextual forces and issues that may be going on in the context of that life that interfere with people being able to use the processes and interfere with accomplishing the tasks of the stages. And that's just a backdrop for all changes that we're trying to make. And then we found a couple of markers at the very beginning, even in my dissertation research, looking at kind of a decisional balance and looking at self-efficacy. Bandura had just come out with that self-efficacy in '77, talking about it more. And so we included those, and it was in our research, it always seemed like those were good markers of decisional balance in the early phases and self-efficacy in the later phases. So this model then gives you a template or a perspective. It's just a heuristic, as they say. It's just a kind of a way to kind of think about this process and understand it better. The reason that the model has gone all over is that health promotion and disease prevention require behavior change. And Em, did you have somebody has raised their hand, so okay. So health promotion, disease prevention require behavior change. And that's whether you're talking about cancer prevention. So this model's been used with cancer screening and other kinds of health behaviors, health promotion, exercise, diet, safety and injury prevention. NHTSA uses the model in some of its work, mental health conditions, and substance use disorders. But the issue is the behavior change is similar, but the pattern is somewhat different. So for some of these, we're talking about initiating or starting a behavior. For some of these, we're talking about stopping a behavior. And for many of these, we're talking about modifying a behavior. And so the model has really been helpful in terms of looking at all of those different kinds of patterns of change. One of the things that we realize, we can say people change voluntarily, and voluntarily is important because this is a voluntary intentional change process that we're talking about, not another kind, not a developmental process, not a imposed change. It's a voluntary intentional change process. And when we say people, we could actually say you, or I, because all of us do the same thing. So when do we change? Well, we change when we become interested and concerned about the need for change. We become convinced that this change is good for us or it's going to benefit us more than it's going to cost us, because all change costs a little bit. Then we have to organize some kind of plan of action to kind of implement that decision and get committed to implementing it. And then we've got to take the actions that are necessary to make and sustain the change. So this is the process of change that we can look at. And if you look at the model in terms of the stages are really exemplify that particular perspective. And we have labels, and a lot of people kind of use the labels of pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, and they stand for kind of where the person is in that process. But always the more important thing are the tasks. So the issue is not that, I now have somebody in pre-contemplation. The task is that that person has to get interested, concerned, and willing to consider change. The same in contemplation, you have to do a risk-reward analysis and decision making. Then in preparation, you've got to get committed and create a plan. I like to say whenever I get to preparation, it's kind of like, it's great that you joined the gym. However, just joining the gym is not action. You do not get to count it as exercise or whatever until you actually go. So the commitment, following through on the commitment, is really implementing the plan, and that's really the action phase. And as most of you know, we have thought about action based on some of the relapse stuff that I'll talk about a little later, as lasting, the action stage lasting 3 to 6 months to really create a good solid basis for a new pattern of behavior. And then maintenance moves on after that. It's consolidating that change into a lifestyle. And I saw that David Kosp kind of mentioned earlier that there are versions of this where the very first version we couldn't identify the decision-making stage that we talked about, that determination stage that we had kind of talked about in earlier stuff. And so we just went with pre-contemplation, contemplation, action, and maintenance. That's a very early version of this model. The determination was the second version, and then we ended up kind of talking about preparation as the middle stage, the transition stage. So what it does then is it gives you a template, not only of the tasks, but also some of the concerns about motivation, decision-making, self-efficacy. It gives us some sense of what gets people out of pre-contemplation, personal concerns, environmental pressures, as well as kind of activating some of these cognitive processes. This is where the decisional balance kind of comes in the middle of this first part, the pre-action phases, and then the behavioral processes are what are used in the later stages. Are important, more important. And then we have this thing called relapse, either from action or maintenance. People relapse, and we thought of it originally as a stage of change, but it's not. The people who were relapsers in our very first studies that we followed really looked very different from, they weren't really a separate group. They were either kind of back in pre-contemplation, contemplation, or preparation for making the change again. Some of them were ready to kind of do that. Others were ready to just give up. So the idea is kind of, well, what then is important or necessary to complete each of these tasks and to get through this and all the way through to maintenance. We know that movement through the stages isn't linear. It consists of getting stuck, some progression sometimes, some regression, some slips and lapses, and then relapse, and then the recycling. And as I said, relapse isn't a stage of change. Recycling through the process is more the reality, it seems to us, from the research that we were doing. So, but basically, if you understand that, it's a learning perspective. So in psychology, it's successive approximation learning, not one trial learning. And successive approximation learning is kind of learning bit by bit. And so sometimes the inability to get it totally right just helps us to kind of build on that to kind of get it better the next time. So that's what successive approximation learning is about. Ideally, all of us would like to see this side be the way behavior change looks. A straight line, beeline right to the change. It's not that simple or not that much more complicated than that. And this is what it more really looks like. And that's why we've always had this from the beginning. We've kind of thought about the stages of change model as also a kind of a cyclical kind of process. So people kind of come in, they think about change, they negotiate a plan, they get into action. If this is a good change and they've kind of done the other things well, they could move from action into maintenance. Otherwise, they go back into relapse and then move back through the stages. So this cyclical model has been one that I think has really been helpful to a lot of providers to kind of help them see how the movement is there. And we talk about multiple treatments, but actually people make multiple attempts at change, even with and without treatment. So this seems to be a picture of how that process goes. So up until now, I think most of us have heard about the stages and the tasks having been used to assess where somebody's is in making an intentional behavior change, and how can we help them on the journey. Okay, I'm going to switch today and talk a little bit about these stages as a blueprint for analyzing where clients have been in their journey of prior unsuccessful attempts to change and what they can learn. So we know there's a clear difference between the pre-action stages and the action stages. And the question is always kind of, what do you need to do here in order to kind of make the transition through to preparation into action? And then what do you need to do here to kind of stay into action? And that's really what we're talking about. So the question always becomes a lot from lay people, but also from some providers, I would imagine. Why can't people just get this right the first time? And I'm not saying that there's no one who does that. So there may be somebody, because I used to say nobody does it the first time. And then there's always somebody in the back of the room who raised their hand and go, I quit smoking the first time I tried. Okay, all right. So there are some people who get it right the first time. But the majority of people don't necessarily get it right the first time. Because learning how to manage and overcome obstacles, it takes time, it takes energy, it takes focus. And there are many ways this recovery can become compromised. So it's a complicated process with moving parts. And so recovery and building a new pattern of behavior is more marathon than sprint. So there also, I think, what I identified in the book that Tom was talking about, there are mechanisms of addiction that I think are key in terms of kind of things that kind of compromise. And neuroadaptation is one of those. I'll talk about these in a minute. Impaired self-regulation and the importance or salience of the behavior. And then with all lifestyle behavior changes, there's always complicating personal, social, environmental factors. Self-control is a critical issue, and entropy, kind of moving back and losing energy and focus, even after you've made a change. And many of us can identify with that as we tried to get regular exercise or physical activity or whatever. We can understand that process and the things that get in the way. So let me talk just for a minute about the well-maintained addiction, which is the end of the initiation of the addiction and the beginning of the recovery process. There's a small set of mechanisms that contribute to maintenance of the addiction and challenge how people can complete the tasks adequately. Okay, so we need to address these. These are not they're not the stages of change, but they are processes that of mechanisms of addiction that we need to address as we're kind of working on the tasks of the stages. So one is neurobiological adaptation. There are brain and biological adaptations to frequent exposure to addictive behaviors. They do hijack some functions. And it is that why a lot of people call it, and NIDA calls it, a brain disease. However, that's not all that's going on. There's also reduced and impaired self-regulation. The loss of control and compromised self-regulation often precedes, so even as they're developing this behavior, that's a risk factor. But after you develop what you can talk about as a moderate to severe substance use disorder or addictive behavior, you can see that undermines self-regulation. Part of it's the neurobiological adaptation, part of it is the behavioral conditioning and all of that goes on. So it can be called a behavioral control disease. And then finally, salience. The addictive behavior becomes so valued a reinforcer that it becomes really a central part of the individual's life. It becomes ubiquitous and a potent force. and undermines the value of other behaviors. So this is why we can call it also a crisis of values, or a spiritual disease, if you want to go there. So these mechanisms are critical to us kind of looking at that, and these interfere with and have to be dealt with as we're trying to get people to do the tasks of the stages of change. So the cyclical model for successfully sustained change that I think happens in a lot of cases is addressing the addiction mechanisms, so overcoming habit and neuroadaptation, finding support for impaired self-regulation. I call that scaffolding, and talk about it a little bit later, and then beginning to build new meaningful life. So as the recovery that SAMSHA talked about it's really forward-looking. It's looking at building a self-directed life that includes new behaviors and absence of former risk behaviors. So you're not just getting rid of some things, you're also building in some things. So the key to successful recycling is this: persistent efforts, repeated attempts that learn from the past attempts, the perspective of never giving up, and this stick and stay. This is a woman who was gave birth substance exposed pregnancy, and then went into treatment, and is doing really well, and kind of with her baby and with herself, and is a counselor now. And we interviewed her for a project that we were doing on substance exposed newborns. And I said, what would you tell other people to do? And she just said, just stick and stay. You've got to stay with it. You don't really want to do it at the beginning, but you've got to keep going and sticking with it. So I do think that perspective of kind of staying with it and keeping going and learning from the past is not new, but it is. We're going to kind of hopefully highlight it a little more. So the role of unsuccessful attempts to change in recovery and behavior change. What is that role? Well, the first of all, I start thinking, well, if this happens so often, there's got to be a purpose or some meaning or function. So what's the function of this failing and being unsuccessful in relapse and recycling, getting into recovery? So that's where we're going to go next in terms of talking about those. Many of you, actually, any of us who do addiction research probably have this slide somewhere in our repertoire, because this is a relapse from the 70s. It's a relapse curve. Everybody here is abstinent. And then if you take total abstinence, there's a dramatic drop in the first 3 months, and this is why we talk about action being 3 to 6 months, because by the time you get to about 6 months, there's a leveling off. And at 12 months, there's only, 20, 30% of the people who started out abstinent who continue to be abstinent for 12 months, successive. Oh, well, that's an old study, right? Well, Project Match, we had 950 outpatients. The abstinent rate for people who are totally abstinent for the 1 year follow-up was 24%. Relapse replication study that was done by Gerard Connors and Dennis Donovan, and I think Bill Miller was in there too. Abstinent at 12 months was 18%. Now these are controlled studies with very trained therapists or providers using the best available kinds of activities and treatments that we have. The combined study actually added in medications, but at follow-up, 80% of the people had one or more heavy drinking days. So when we look at this, you kind of go, okay, well, what's happening? We're doing the best we can, and we're still getting some of this relapse. So what's that about? Well, the first thing I think we need to realize is relapse is not a problem of drug abuse. Relapse is not a problem of addictions. Relapse is a problem of behavior change. And this is Tom McClellan did a study a while back where he was looking at relapse and talking about, we need to treat drug addiction as a chronic condition, just like other conditions, because the relapse rates are the same. Actually, in hypertension and asthma, they're even higher. So we need to kind of, I think, the addiction group, we got a bad rap. That we're responsible for all the relapse, when relapse is there. I mean, relapse is true in diabetes treatment. Relapse is true in almost all behavior changes. It's certainly true in physical activity and diet. Um, and we understand that this is there, and what you see a lot of times on TV are people kind of asking you to kind of try this now because the other things have failed, but now this is the brand new shiny thing that's going to really make everything happen, to convince you. So relapse, like as I said, is a natural part of the process of behavior change. It's not a required part, but it is a natural part because it's a part of all the different process of behavior change. In mental health conditions, it involves some biological processes, but you can also talk about, if you see it through the lens of behavior change, if it involves non-compliance with behavioral activities, you still have to get some of these folks to take the medication, to battle some of the depressive thoughts and do some of the other kinds of things. So, and they don't always follow through on that. I mean, actually, prescriptions, people don't take prescriptions as prescribed. And most of you know that. So most successful changers make repeated efforts to get it right. It's part of the learning process to correct for prior inadequate completion of some of the tasks that we just talked about in terms of the stages. So first of all, let's talk about what is a relapse, because I think it's important to kind of understand that. So we've tried to define relapse in many different ways. We've used numbers of whatever use, or numbers of drinks, or numbers of other kinds of things. We've used drug tests. We've used consequences. All of those seem inadequate. And even the abstinence only outcome, or it's a relapse, seems kind of somewhat problematic because it leaves no room for a slip. So I've come up to the thing of saying that the best way we can define relapse is actually through the eyes of the individual making the behavior change. So relapse is when the individual gives up on the attempt to change. So if I say, okay, I'm keeping trying, I'm keeping doing this, I've fallen, I've gotten up, and keep going, that person for me is still in action. It's when they kind of go and say, okay, I can't do this anymore. But even then, it's not a total failure, but a learning opportunity, even though many people feel a failure when they give up. Individuals who give up on this change return to a pre-action stage. So that's why we say that relapse isn't a stage of change. So to achieve recovery, they got to try again and to move successfully through these stages. So the role of recycling is to learn how to adequately accomplish the tasks and engage the mechanisms needed for recovery. And that's the premise that I'm going to talk with you more about. And this is just a kind of a picture to kind of demonstrate that. So you can move on ahead with a little interest and concern, or a significant amount of interest and concern. You can make a decision to make a behavior change, and then you can make a really firm decision to make a behavior change. So people move forward in this process with more or less adequately done tasks. And I can tell you, I mean, I'm a former smoker. I quit smoking many times, kind of moving in this process and kind of going, okay, this is it. I've done this. I made a decision, move on. And then, later that day, kind of say, okay, that's it. I can't do it today. Why did I pick today? So our change, if we don't have adequate kind of work in the background of this in terms of moving through these tasks, then we get relapse. And relapse can happen because of interest and concern. Relapse can happen because of risk reward. It can happen because of any of those issues. And the other issue that I think is really important is to understand that stage tasks build on one another. So they support one another. If some elements are not weak or well done, the entire enterprise can fail. So it's like a little Jenga puzzle there. You know, you take out the wrong thing. If it's not really there, it falls apart. So when we think about the change process, solid decisions are built on significant interest and concern that leads to stronger commitment and effective plans that are implemented and revised and finally become sustained and part of a lifestyle. So it is a pyramid. It is a kind of a building on top of one another. So how do people make a successful change? Well, to do that, you have to have significant concern and interest, just like we went before when we were talking about how do people change. That leads to a decision that yields a strong and secure decision making that underpins a firm decision and commitment to make a viable, effective plan that includes how and when the actions begin and how to deal with threats, and that sticks with the change and revises the plan when the plan isn't working, and that is sustained through difficulties and unexpected events and slips and struggles. So there's a lot of contextual stuff that actually kind of plays on this as well as you're trying to kind of complete these tasks in a successful way or an adequate way to support success. So the whole idea then is obviously this is not new, try, fail, try again, succeed, you know, just keep trying, okay? That's one of the things that lots of people will tell you. The one thing I will caution you is if you see multiple unsuccessful attempts, that somebody keeps trying and failing, trying and failing, trying and failing, it may mean or indicate that there are problems in the context or in some of the co-occurring conditions that you have to kind of at least address. Or a failure to learn, maybe that's the other piece. It could be that there's a failure to learn from the flaws. So the person isn't learning, they're just doing the same thing over and over again. And you know, that doesn't necessarily lead to better change or a better change attempt. So you just need to be careful about that. So yes, it's true. If you first don't succeed, try and try again. But the issue is to try smarter and not just harder. So as I told Tom earlier, I've been doing a lot of reading in failure, and there's a lot of books out there on failure. And the book, you know, Sayed and others have written books on this and kind of talked about, actually kind of really talked about the healthcare industry as one where there's a culture of evasion of failure. So even in medical and healthcare, failure is an anomaly. It's an unfortunate event. We're doing the best we could. It just happened. We can't explain it. So all of that keeps us away from learning about failure. And Sayed's prototype of people who really learn is really the airline industry. I know they've been having trouble in the last couple of weeks with some systems that aren't doing that, but a lot of that is because things that they knew were not being done, not that they didn't find what was wrong or what was going on. But in the airline industry, there's a system where failure is data rich, and where mistakes are not stigmatized, they're regarded as learning opportunities. There's the two black boxes that trying to get the electronic system on board, and the other cockpit voice recorders. They're much more trying to kind of look at, there's an independent investigation, and they don't just look at the plane and what happened in the last 10 minutes. They look at what was happening the day before. They look at where the plane had been before that. They look at other things that have happened with other planes and try to figure out how that happens. And so once they find out what the problem is, they share the results with everybody, with all the pilots. They actually simulate some of these so that it won't happen again. So in the airline industry, failure is valued. In science, failure is valued. Most of our scientific experiments fail. And it's from the failures that we kind of learn and move on and get there. So there's one clear message from people in recovery. You know, this is from Ann Fletcher's book, where she interviewed lots and lots of people in recovery. And these are comments: never, never, never give up. Never stop trying. If one thing doesn't work, try something else. I think you need to use your resources and your lifelines, but also I think you need to keep trying and learning from the process. So you got to learn from the failures and not simply do the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. So Anne made a very interesting quote: instead of dwelling on past failures, it's more productive to learn from your past, treat the past recovery attempts as a rich library of experiences to shape your future. I think that's where we're going to go next. I'm going to stop there for just a minute and see if there's any quick questions that people have. And Luke?
Yes, Dr. DiClemente, thank you for pausing there. It's been a wonderful presentation so far. A couple questions that came in already have to do, the first one with depictions of the stages of change that include an exit or termination stage where others don't necessarily include that stage. Which one is more accurate, or is there just an evolution that has occurred?
So part of it's an evolution, part of it's my understanding of how change happens. In terms of there's maintenance of the actual behavior change. So we do need to leave some of those behind. So if I'm a former smoker, so I am on the other side of that, 30 years past all of that. And for me now, it's not an issue. So that's really what we're talking about in terms of moving into termination. Now, I have, it's functional because I have other things that I need to do around diet, around exercise, around other kinds of things that I need to do. And so we all have a limited focus and there. So many times we put some of those, I think, in the past and move ahead and deal with other things. So that was the idea behind termination. It's not that recovery is terminated. Recovery is an ongoing process forever. It's that a specific behavior change you may be able to terminate from maintenance and then move some of that energy onto some other challenge that you need to do.
Very good.
So that's how you do that. Okay.
The next question had to do with the difference between consolidation and implementation. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, implementation is really kind of how do you kind of you have a goal and you're trying to meet that goal and reach that goal. That's implementation. Consolidation, I think, is a whole different thing. It's bringing some things together. I'm not sure how exactly it fits into the change process.
Okay. And then finally, for this round of questions, there's a question that seems to be two questions related around long-term recovery. If there's something different about the long-term motivation in recycling, or does this apply across whatever length of time a person has been in recovery?
So yeah, let me answer that also a little bit later with talking about maintenance and when people kind of fail or haven't go back to kind of using after having reached maintenance.
Okay.
But just quickly, I think the issue is really that that recovery is an ongoing thing. There's more. It's multiple changes. It's multidimensional. It isn't one thing. So yes, you have to put behind you the behavior that's causing you so many problems, but you also have to build in front of you all of a lot of other kinds of things. And so I do think that, and I'll talk a little more about that as we go down the road here.
Very good. Then we'll turn it back to you, Doctor.
Thank you. So the things that would get in the way of successful recycling: blame. Who's responsible? Why did it happen? What is there to blame? Blame undermines accurate reporting, acknowledging errors, learning about stuff, undermines information critical to be successful. So again, finger pointing and blame are not really helpful. And sometimes programs get into this with clients. The program didn't work. That's what the client says. You didn't work the program. That's what the program says. but those are not helpful responses to someone who's failed and has been unsuccessful in the behavior change that they were trying to get help for. The other is addressing stigma. And stigma is there for substance users, even if they're not trying to go into recovery. It's part of our social fabric. But self-stigma is often worse than even the social stigma that many people who are addicted kind of feel. And we need to kind of, if we're going to really explore unsuccessful attempts, we need to kind of also support self-compassion, which can be a powerful way to mitigate self-stigma. And some of that through mindfulness, making sure we're kind of working with the individual and making sure that we share this common humanity. We're all human. We all make mistakes. We all at times fail. And then treating ourselves with kindness and respect in the face of pain and failure. So a lot of this, I mean, some of the motivational interviewing style and spirit kind of capture some of this, but a lot of this is really important as the context. So the context of your relationship in order to be able to explore the what went wrong. So key to successful recycling: blame and guilt get in the way. You got to support re-engagement in the process, because a lot of people want to stand off on the sidelines after they have been unsuccessful and say, okay, I don't think I can do it. Persistent efforts, repeated attempts, after learning as much as possible from our prior attempts, helping to take the next step and match their strategy to the current stage. And then talking to the person in encouraging ways and focusing on resilience and past successes is another way to kind of do that. So I'm going to quickly, so we're trying to work smarter, not harder, not just harder. We may have to work harder too. So before moving into kind of learning from success, from our unsuccessful attempts, I just want to make a plea to kind of maybe stop using the term relapse. It's stigmatizing. It's not as stigmatizing in medicine. If relapsed, you relapsed, the cancer came back, but it is stigmatizing in terms of behavioral conditions. It contributes to a fatalistic failure identity. And so it is hard to define, as I said. It's confusing to measure, and it's problematic to use with chronic conditions, because chronic conditions are chronic conditions. The chronicity is the fact that they kind of keep recurring. So maybe we should be talking more about recycling on the road to recovery, that this is a setback in sustaining change, a mistake that can be corrected, an opportunity to learn. We need to kind of change our way of kind of looking at unsuccessful attempts and look at a long-term multidimensional perspective on recovery. So we're trying to always help people focus on getting well and getting better. So now let me just talk about what can go wrong and how people can do things. Now, many individuals get stuck actually in the pre-action stages and never make it to action. However, when you look at these, they have considered change. So they need to work on some of the pre-action tasks and get them done well enough to move into action. However, if the failure is in flight, so after taking off on a behavior change, then I think we really need to look at the entire process of change. Okay? So failure to get off the launching pad is different from failure to get into flight. So people coming to Smart Recovery and other treatments and mutual support programs are not change virgins. Before seeking help, most people have tried to change on their own, and often many times. If they've not followed through with a bona fide attempt, they thought about it, made a decision, but never found the commitment or implemented a plan or took action, this is not relapse. This is a failure to launch. They never got out there. So remember, I think it's really important that no one can relapse or have an unsuccessful attempt to change unless they've had some success, no matter how limited. Okay? So you have to have success in order to kind of have an unsuccessful attempt. And I think that's important to realize, because that a lot of people don't think that. They just move from one to the other. So I'm going to quickly run through what can go wrong and what can providers do with these different tasks. So with interest and concern, what are some of the things that can go wrong? Well, a lot of times the interest and concern is not is driven by external events. So it's really mostly extrinsic motivation. And it's not to say that that's bad. It can be helpful in getting people to kind of feel like the change is important. It can be helpful in kind of um, uh, trying to convince them to kind of get into treatment. But if it's being done for others, it's more like imposed change, which is not voluntary and intentional change. So for intentional change, you really need some intrinsic motivation. I'm doing this for me, for my well-being, for whatever. And without that, the change can be difficult to sustain. And it's interesting because intrinsic motivation predicts enhanced learning, performance, creativity, optimal development, and psychological wellness. So this is the research that Daichi and Ryan have been doing. Intrinsic motivation is also associated with brain activities. So this is a really beginning kind of area that looks like intrinsic motivation has connections with brain activities that are related to autonomy, mastery, and self-directed activities. So we need to check about how extrinsic and intrinsic motivators have played a role in this particular change attempt, because I think I'm talking from the perspective of debriefing an unsuccessful change attempt. And if I'm doing that, I need to be changing if I'm looking at extrinsic and intrinsic motivators and how it played a role and whether it played a role in the relapse. So as a provider, you want to use motivational strategies, focus on understanding the extrinsic motives that may be there to avoid consequences or threats, or the benefits of others can be helpful to get consideration, but always pressure from extrinsic factors can also evoke resistance. So promote choosing change rather than being forced to change. Help them with that. Concerns are related to consequences and impact. So when I say interest and concern, which are the tasks of the pre-contemplation, the concerns are related to consequences and the impact on the self and others. Interest is related in the more personal experiences and reasons for making a change. So concerns are important to bring you there, but I think we're all trying to work on interest and kind of make sure that this time, for the next change attempt, that the interest is related to the personal experience and reasons for changing. So evaluating values and personal benefits or reasons get at actually more intrinsic motivations. And one good question to kind of keep in mind is we're trying to find out what's pushing you to make this change and what's pulling you to make this change. And are the things that you talk about different from the prior times that you've made an attempt or the last time you made an attempt? So that's interest and concern. What about decision making? Well, decision making is also important because you're looking at both the pros and cons of the status quo, where I currently am, and the pros and cons of making the change. So a good decision has important considerations both for the cons of the current situation and the benefits or pros for the change. A lot of times people will see the cons of the current situation, but undervalue the benefits of the change process. And if the decision is based on weak decisional considerations, it won't be strong enough to build strong commitment. So weak decisions promote giving up early. The best client decisional considerations include both intrinsic, personal, value-driven ones and meaningful extrinsic ones. So you want both to try and kind of promote both, especially in this next attempt that they're going to try, especially if weak decision-making was part of the first failure. Now, maybe the interest and concern and was fine, but decision-making failed, or maybe it was they both went okay, but they failed in terms of the planning. So if you're the provider, what are you trying to do? Explore the cons and pros of the current behavior and the pros and cons of the potential change. Ask not just about the considerations, but how important are these considerations to you? We've started in work that we've been doing, trying to kind of get people to rate the consideration on a scale of 1 to 10. How important is it? Avoid exploring sustained talk, as you learn from doing the motivational stuff and the reasons not to change. You can create a sustained talk spiral downward if you kind of focus a lot on the sustained talk. Promote self and environmental reevaluation, re-examining what you're doing, the reasons and the choices that you're making. So you're trying to always help people do that during this decision-making phase. And try and get access to their values and their hopes for the future. Link these to the current status and help envision a future that's different from the past. Be careful of impulsive decisions. So they often look very determined and they're going to do it. I'm just going to do it. But they often aren't built on solid considerations and promote sometimes what is a rush into action. And so ask if that was what happened the last time. Did you? I know it happened to me several times while I was trying to quit smoking. So yeah, it can happen. So if we now move from pre-contemplation and contemplation to the tasks of the preparation stage, you've got two things here. You've got commitment and you've got planning. So commitment is the resolve and dedication to engage our own personal self-control strength in the service of implementing the behavior change. So strength of commitment is also related to strength of decision-making. If I have a weak decision, I often have weak commitment. And weak commitment leads to disorganized and easily discouraged attempts. It's important to know here in the commitment piece that self-control is needed to manage and decide and to plan and to manage emotions. If you have someone who has their self-control strength that was totally exhausted by stress and some other life situations, that's going to undermine commitment. And so you do need to kind of pay attention to the self-control strength. And then bridging the intention to behavior gap, as they call it. Procrastination is the enemy of preparation. Procrastination goes along with lack of commitment. They undermine preparing, planning, and implementing a change. So that's what can go wrong. So if you're a provider, you want to support the commitment by focusing on the future and building a new life and identity. You want to listen for weak commitment language, wishing and hoping rather than dedicated and determined and pledging and personal obligation. You want to offer support and scaffolding. Scaffolding is really support that you put up so that when the person is trying to build the behavior change, there's support for them to do that. And that's especially important the more self-control is compromised. And remember that impaired self-regulation is one of the addiction mechanisms we talked about. So you need to be especially careful in terms of building this scaffolding to support this self-control strength and help to deal with contextual challenges. So planning, let's jump in there and see if I keep moving on this. So good planning involves goal setting. Vague, unrealistic goals and lack of an implementation plan and time frame leave people unprepared to make a behavior change. So that's a really important piece. You want to try and help people make specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timed goals. If you don't get the changer as a collaborator in the planning, the plan is problematic. And you need plans that are not only effective, you know them to work, but that are also acceptable, accessible, and realistic for the client. That's why you need the collaboration. And low self-efficacy to perform the planned behaviors is also important, and you need to kind of figure out what skills are needed to implement the plan. And finally, some of you may have heard this before, a change plan is different from a treatment plan. A treatment plan is what you're going to do. A change plan is what the client's going to do. The change plan is always more important than the treatment plan is. And the treatment plan should always be in the service of the change plan. You may differ with me on that, but that's how I see it. And then with planning, you're really trying to kind of help people explore the goals that they had in the past. Sometimes they use very vague goals. I want sobriety, Well, what does that mean? So specificity is critical to measure outcomes. You're trying to build self-efficacy, assess skills, create a timeline, um, a collaborative relationship that's built on trust and compassion about their prior lack of success. So here's where you're going to help people to be compassionate about them in terms of setting up goals. Go, I can't do this. I've tried before. So build a strong support system, offer hope. Okay, we're in action now. So what can go wrong in the action phase? Well, you should be trying to kind of find out, get a detailed account of the successes in terms of how long, how they overcame some obstacles, what they did, what were the important plans of did they follow the important parts of the plan, check about the viable plan and level of commitment, assess the contextual influences, talk about the abandonment. So if in the action stage, they really kind of crumbled relatively early, the last time they made an attempt, if it happened early in the first 3 to 6 months, it indicates maybe a problem in decision-making, planning, and commitment, not in action. So you need to go back and look at those things when your person's talking about those. If it's longer, and so they're past maybe 3 to 4 or 5 months, 6 months, it's really a problem of sustaining change and possibly not finding satisfaction or meaning or benefits. So the life situations and the lack of social capital also can undermine the action, successful action. So again, you want to kind of help them to see what happened and when it happened and what the problem was. So here, when you move into maintenance, if someone has gotten 3 to 6 months of sobriety or recovery, we talk about them moving into maintenance. So then the problem becomes one of sustaining action. So make sure at this point you understand where they are now and trying to do it again. But the best way to do that is to try and find out what happened the last time. What happened to undermine significant success? Was it a loss of motivation? Was it significant events? Were it mental health issues? What about lack of ongoing support? Lack of finding meaning, alternatives, and lifestyle? Inadequate completion of the pre-action tasks? What were the danger signs that were ignored? Or were there danger signs that were ignored? So when you're trying to debrief someone who's been in maintenance, it's a little different than someone who never made it further than being in action for a month or two. And you then need to kind of go back also and look at the whole process. Because what we're trying to do is to make this next attempt, whether it's completely successful or not, better. And that's really what you're trying to do. So that's why you're supporting an affirming commitment, analyze the obstacles, find meaning in the lifestyle, find meaning in lifestyle after the change, intervene with mental health problems, provide routine and emergency check-ins. We should be checking in regularly with many of our patients. And most of our patients. It always has struck me that we have 6-month check-ins for our teeth, but when we're talking about something as significant as a behavior change, we don't have as many check-ins, or we don't check in as often, and that's why kind of Smart Recovery and AA are helpful, because they have lots and lots of resources to keep checking in with. So what I'm arguing is, how do we promote successful recycling and recovery and sustain change? I'm arguing to not just focus on the moment when the failure or the unsuccessful attempt happened, because there's a lot. It's more of a picture, a larger picture. But most of the time, we have focused on triggers and coping and what we have to do for the next time. When I'm arguing, when you're debriefing a relapse or a failure to sustain a behavior change, you have to examine the whole process. So examine about the interest and concern, examine the decision that they did last time, examine how good the plan was, examine the commitment, examine the alternatives that they found, or the reinforcements or the supports. So we need to be looking across the whole, we need to be using this template as a blueprint to try and help them kind of see what may have gone wrong what may have not been done well enough, and how to move farther. So I'm hoping that this template or blueprint can empower both the provider and the client. Remember, recovery is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And even in marathons, people make many 5, 10, and 20-mile runs, and ultimately reach the 26 miles. So failure is filled with important information. And I am afraid sometimes we are missing it. But to do that, you have to have the courage to examine lack of success and to broaden our scope to examine the entire process, to be able to learn from the past and improve the change process and the outcomes for the next attempt. So we all have to get, I think, a little more comfortable and effective in dealing with lack of success in order to promote successful recycling and recovery. Michael Jordan has said it, you know, he failed over and over, and that's why he succeeds. So we do need to kind of value failure and turn it into success. So we'll have a few minutes for questions. I may have run over a couple of minutes here.
Oh, that was excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. DiClemente. I took specific note of this notion that changing or revising your plan is not failing. Changing or revising your plan is something that you can do and be a part of in your own journey. So a couple questions that came in quickly. What would you say the difference is between saying I can't do it versus I choose not to do it in terms of recovery?
So I think those are two ways people stay in pre-contemplation. Okay, so you can be in pre-contemplation by choice. And there are people who decide to do it. They say, I like what I'm doing. My lifestyle is not perfect, but I'm okay with it. I'm not making that change. So that's a choice. There's others who really, it's hopeless. That's what they're feeling. So they feel like they're hopeless. So what I've argued in other places is when you think about being in pre-contemplation, you need to kind of figure out what keeps them in pre-contemplation. Is it the choice? Is it the hopelessness? Is it the rationalizations that they're making for themselves? What keeps them there? And so that's how I would kind of understand that.
Very good. Very good. And then just so we can have a quick definition to leave with is clarifying what recycling is. How would you define recycling as that distinction from relapse?
So relapse is, as I said, I think if we define it as people giving up on change. Once a person has given up on the change, then they end up being someplace in other parts of the process of change. The one good thing that I think we did with the model and the stages is everybody can have a place in that process. If you're thinking about a specific behavior change, all of you are in some place along that dimension. So either you're in pre-contemplation or your contemplation or preparation or your action or your maintenance. So once a person, recycling is kind of going back in and trying again to redo some of the tasks of those stages and get it right the next time. So it's the process where people go back through those things. The relapse gets them, makes the last change unsuccessful. But then when you're talking about where are you now, you have to look at where are they currently in terms of their stage of change.
Very good. And finally, in terms of questions that have been submitted, would you say self-control is synonymous with willpower?
No, I don't think so, because I think willpower has the connotation that all you need to do is will it. Self-control has a lot more of a broader kind of perspective because it involves your ability to delay some things. It involves your ability to kind of manage emotions. It involves, so it's really much more connected to what we call the executive cognitive functioning and emotion regulation pieces. Whereas willpower just seems to say you can move yourself through this just with on the force of your will. And some people try to change that way. It works for a while. I just think it gets really hard if that's all you're you're focused on is your willpower, it gets hard to sustain it because you get tired.
Very good.
Dr.
Thank you.
DiClemente, if I could take a moment as the executive director of SMART to thank you for being here today. And I had one quick follow-up question just from my perspective. We've been working on the revised handbooks for SMART Recovery, and knowing that there's a mix of individuals in the room who are professionals and others who are lay volunteers who are leading free mutual support group meetings in their community. Would you say that from the perspective of the lay volunteer leader, that what we're really focused on is creating that supportive context for the individual's change journey, and that some of the things that you were saying that a provider would do at various stages of change are not necessarily what you would expect a volunteer facilitator of a meeting, for example, to be doing as part of their facilitation of the meeting. Would love to just hear your thoughts on that distinction.
Yeah, that's really a good distinction. I agree that we all have different roles and different skills to be able to use in this. I do think that provider and lay leader need to have the same kind of perspective, however. So I would say that everybody still needs that perspective of, the learning that unsuccessful attempts, you can learn a lot from those.
Sure, absolutely.
That to work against the stigma, to work against the blame, and to kind of continue to kind of do that. So I do think that we can provide the context where the individual can explore themselves a little bit more. Everybody can do that. Others may have specific skills, mindfulness skills or relaxation skills or other kinds of things that they want to share with the folks and do that and have been trained to do that. So yes, I do think there are distinctions. I think that the process, however, if you respect the process and the learning process, that's, I think, the main critical thing.
Thank you. Very helpful.
Right.
Excellent. Well, the thanks and appreciation are pouring into the chat, and the people are just really thrilled that you were able to cover such great material in a comprehensive and effective way. Tom, did you have anything else you'd like to say before we sign off?
Just thank you so much. This is a great addition to our memorial lecture series, and we're going to be thinking about these ideas for a long time. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
And as mentioned in the chat, there will be a recording and these slides will become available. I will send out an email to the registrants next week, and that is when you will receive that information. So thank you once again, Dr. Carlo DiClemente, for your presentation. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate you. Take care.
Thank you all.